It was supposed to be a victory. Instead, it became a betrayal. Greece had already suffered through the flames of invasion and occupation. But when liberation came, it did not bring peace. It brought a new kind of war, a civil war, brutal and unrelenting, ignited not by foreign tanks or bombs, but by promises, betrayals, and foreign ambitions disguised as salvation. In the shadows of ancient Athens and across the bloodied hills of the Peloponnese, Greek patriots who had once stood side by side against fascism now turned their rifles on one another. Monarchists, communists, republicans all claimed to fight for a free Greece. But who defined freedom? And who, truly, ruled Greece after the Nazis fled? Was it the Greeks themselves? Or was Greece merely the first chessboard in a game called the Cold War? This is the story of how Churchill, the communists, and the CIA would battle not across oceans, but across the soul of a nation once called the cradle of democracy. The German invasion of Greece in April 1941 shattered what remained of a nation already weakened by political infighting and a disastrous war with fascist Italy. Within weeks, Greek sovereignty existed only in name. Athens fell. The monarchy fled. And 3 long years of Axis occupation began. But even as Nazi boots stomped through ancient streets, resistance began to stir. Yet it was not united, and certainly not simple. There were monarchists loyal to the exiled King Georgios II. There were republicans hoping for a modern, secular state. And then, there were the communists hardened, organized, and unyielding. In September of 1941, the Communist Party of Greece, under the guidance of the charismatic Georgios Tsiantos, created the National Liberation Front, known as the EAM. By December, its military wing, the Greek People's Liberation Army, or ELIS, had begun striking back. Their discipline, demand for obedience, and promise of a united front against the occupiers stood in stark contrast to the fragmented loyalties of the monarchists and liberals. Though the Greeks had long distrusted centralized authority, a legacy of centuries under Ottoman and foreign rule desperation changed minds. ELIS became the most formidable resistance force in the country, but their rise sparked fear, too, not only among fellow Greeks, but in London. Britain had not forgotten Greece. After all, the Greeks had humiliated Mussolini's army in 1941 of the first major Allied victories of the war. In March 1941, British troops arrived in the Mediterranean. But behind those troops were shadows. MI6 agents and the newly formed Special Operations Executive Churchill's so-called Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Their mission? Sabotage, support the resistance, and contain it. British agents were embedded among the Greek partisans, arming and training them. But the more effective ELIS became, the more anxious the British grew. They were creating a monster, and they knew it. The British began to see themselves not as allies of the resistance, but as referees in a brewing civil war. While bombs fell and bridges were blown, internal rivalries festered. Other resistance groups, such as EDAs, the National Republican Greek League, clashed with ELIS fighters in back alleys and mountain passes. By 1943, the war's tide had turned. The Allies landed in Sicily. The Nazis began to retreat. But in Greece, the resistance didn't unify. It fractured violently. And still, Britain refused to support the communists. Greece, Churchill said, must not fall to the Reds. In February 1944, the British brokered a ceasefire between warring Greek factions in what came to be known as the Plaka Agreement. But their rejection of a joint Greek resistance army, one dominated by ELIS, made clear which side they truly favored. Meanwhile, in Cairo, the British-backed Free Greek government, an exile regime of monarchists, was collapsing under its own contradictions. King Georgios II refused to allow a regency government. Churchill, his strongest backer, stood firm, but so did the communists, and they were gaining ground. By the spring of 1944, the writing was on the wall. Elas, with tens of thousands of fighters and control over large swathes of the countryside, was no longer just a resistance force. It was a political power, one that had tasted blood, built shadow governments, and believed in a post-war Greece not ruled by kings, but by the people. The monarchy, holed up in Cairo with British support, had become a symbol of foreign interference. Even the Free Greek Prime Minister, Georgios Papandreou, knew that something had to change. In May 1944, under mounting pressure, resistance factions and the exiled government gathered to forge a fragile unity in what would be called the Lebanon Charter. A new Greek government was to be created representing all sides. Elections were promised, and crucially, a referendum on the monarchy's return was agreed upon. On paper, it was a triumph of diplomacy. In reality, it was a ceasefire dressed as a handshake. Churchill had no intention of letting the communists win those elections. And Elas, despite its official gestures of unity, continued to hunt collaborators and rivals with increasing brutality, especially in the Peloponnese, where alleged traitors were rounded up and executed by the thousands. Churchill's response was swift. Operation Manna was drafted, a British-led plan to liberate Greece, with force if necessary. In the fall of 1944, British forces landed in Greece alongside Papandreou's new government. The Nazis, sensing the end, began their retreat. On the 12th of October, Athens was finally free. Or so it seemed. The return of Papandreou to Athens was meant to symbolize national rebirth. Instead, it revealed how fragile that unity truly was. While Papandreou's government controlled the capital, the rest of the country was firmly in the hands of Elas. Papandreou knew he needed to disarm the partisans if his government was to be seen as legitimate. But how do you ask a victorious resistance to lay down arms, especially when they don't trust you? Negotiations dragged on. On the 2nd of December 1944, the communist ministers in Papandreou's cabinet resigned. The next day, thousands marched in Athens to protest the government's refusal to integrate Elas into the national army. The police, under monarchist control, opened fire. 33 protesters were killed. Hundreds were wounded. That single event, a massacre in the heart of Athens, was the spark. Within hours, the Communist Party declared the government illegal. The Greek Civil War had begun. Churchill did not hesitate. He ordered British forces in Athens to intervene not to keep peace, but to crush the communists. He combined the 23rd Armored Brigade with the elite 2nd Parachute Brigade, forming the now infamous Ark Force. Their mission was clear: defend Athens at all costs. But back home, Churchill faced a political firestorm. The war-weary British public had little appetite for a new conflict, especially not one that involved firing on people they had just helped liberate from the Nazis. In Parliament, Churchill was lambasted for dragging Britain into another war. Yet, he stood firm. "It is life or death," he declared, "that we keep Greece out of the communist grasp." On the 16th of December, Elas launched a three-pronged assault on Athens, but the offensive was plagued by defections. Many socialists within the movement balked at the idea of fighting Allied troops, especially those who had supported the resistance just months earlier. The attack failed. By New Year's Eve, British forces had retaken most of southern Athens. The communists, bloodied and confused, pulled back. But Churchill wasn't done. On Christmas Day, 1944, he personally flew to Athens to broker a ceasefire. It was not Papandreou but Churchill who summoned the warring sides. The message was clear. Britain, not Greece, was in charge. A deal was struck. King Georgios II, under pressure from Churchill, agreed to a regency. Archbishop Damaskinos, a respected religious figure, was appointed regent of Greece. Papandreou resigned, and in his place came General Nikolaos Plastiras, a hardline anti-communist. Elas, seeing the rising tide of British power, backed down. They withdrew from Athens. But not before executing thousands of alleged collaborators and abducting over 35,000 civilians, many of them children, to serve as hostages and human shields. At least 4,000 of those abducted never returned. The images of charred villages, mass graves, and kidnapped children ignited a fury across Greece. The communists had lost the moral high ground and would never reclaim it. The formal end of the first phase of civil war came on the 12th of February, 1945, with the signing of the Varkiza Agreement, a British-brokered truce between the Greek government and the defeated EAM-ELAS. The communists agreed to disarm. In return, the government promised to hold democratic elections within the year. But even as ink dried on the agreement, both sides sharpened their knives. On the ground, surrender was uneven and incomplete. Many ELAS units vanished into the countryside rather than hand over weapons. Others buried caches of arms beneath olive trees and churchyards. They didn't trust the government, and with reason. What followed was not reconciliation, but revenge. Across the country, right-wing militias, newly armed with captured communist weapons, began targeting suspected ELAS members, supporters, and sympathizers. Extrajudicial killings became common. Thousands were arrested. Many were sent to isolated islands for indefinite internment. The Greek police and army, now firmly under monarchist control, turned a blind eye, if not a helping hand. Even children were caught in the whirlwind. Both sides began taking minors from contested zones, indoctrinating them in partisan ideology. Entire generations were raised with the trauma of betrayal and the memory of political violence as a fact of life. For all the promises of the Varkiza Agreement, Greece had not found peace. It had simply moved from open war to silent terror. Nikolaos Plastiras, the general turned premier, had hoped to contain the violence, but his own past caught up with him. In a stunning twist, a letter emerged written by Plastiras during the war appealing to Nazi Germany to mediate peace between Greece and fascist Italy. It was political suicide. He was forced to resign in disgrace. His successor, Admiral Petros Voulgaris, inherited not a government, but a battlefield. Vigilante groups, emboldened and unchecked, now controlled vast swaths of rural Greece. In many towns, they were the only authority that mattered. The British, meanwhile, had grown weary. Their empire was strained thin. In April 1946, they began a steady withdrawal that would culminate in a full military exit by 1950. But they did not leave Greece defenseless. In their place, a new patron arrived, one with deeper pockets and global ambition, the United States. President Truman, determined to stop the spread of communism anywhere it threatened post-war order, declared Greece to be of strategic interest. The Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, pledged American support to any nation resisting subjugation by communist forces. Greece would become its first proving ground. The Second Greek Civil War, known to historians as the Third Phase, began not with declarations, but with gunfire. On the 30th of March, 1946, a group of former ELAS partisans attacked a police station in the village of Litohoro, at the base of Mount Olympus. It was a symbolic place, the seat of the gods, now home to a new kind of war. Guerrilla war. The communists, now reorganized as the Democratic Army of Greece, DSE, established strongholds in the rugged mountains along the northern frontier. From these bases, they launched raids, assassinated officials, and claimed towns by night. But they were no longer the dominant force they had been in 1944. Cut off from Soviet aid, Stalin had no interest in antagonizing the West over Greece. They relied on support from Yugoslavia and Albania. But even that lifeline would grow unstable. The British trained and equipped the reconstituted Greek National Army. But the turning point came with full-scale American involvement. Washington didn't just send rifles, they sent advisors, planes, artillery, food, and dollars. Billions of them. The scale of assistance was staggering. American aircraft bombarded mountain positions. Greek-American commandos hunted guerrilla bands with intelligence supplied by the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency. Psychological warfare, propaganda leaflets, and radio broadcasts flooded the countryside. By 1949, the communists were in retreat. Their final redoubt, the Gramos Mountains, near the Albanian border, fell after a brutal campaign. Those who survived fled into exile. On paper, the war was over. But scars do not heal on paper. Greece had been saved, but at what cost? By the time the guns fell silent, over 150,000 Greeks were dead. Hundreds of villages were destroyed. Tens of thousands had fled or been displaced. The economy was shattered. The population was traumatized. And the soul of the nation was fractured. Communists were barred from political life for decades. Many were imprisoned, tortured, or forced into silence. Their children grew up in fear. Their homes were marked. Meanwhile, the right-wing establishment grew stronger. In 1946, King Georgios II returned backed by a dubious referendum. The monarchy was reinstated. Parliamentary democracy limped forward, often interrupted by military intervention and authoritarian rule. Then, in 1967, came the final betrayal. The very same forces that had been empowered to save Greece from communism, the army officers, the secret police, the nationalist ideologues, overthrew the civilian government. The colonel's coup installed a military junta. For 7 years, Greece lived under dictatorship. The cradle of democracy silenced again. And in that silence echoed a question. Was Greece ever truly free? Greece, after its civil war, was no longer merely a sovereign nation. It had become something else, a symbol, a buffer, a pawn. To the west, it was a line that had held, proof that the spread of communism could be stopped, proof that intervention, even violent, even imperial, could save democracy. But to many Greeks, the war had not been about ideology at all. It had been about control. The monarchy returned, but only as a relic, a reminder that foreign preferences, not Greek votes, had shaped the future. Elections were held, but always under the shadow of surveillance, censorship, and fear. Leftists were watched, branded, and excluded. National unity was enforced at gunpoint. The Cold War did not just split Berlin. It cleaved Greek society down the middle. The psychological toll was immense. Villages that once celebrated together now eyed each other in silence. Families split across political lines, fathers who fought for Elas, sons who served in the National Army, cousins who disappeared and were never seen again. It is said that in some Greek towns you could still tell who was on which side by where people chose to sit in church. The Americans had succeeded where the British could not, but their success created dependence. U.S. dollars flowed into Greece through the Marshall Plan, modernizing infrastructure while also binding the economy to American interests. The CIA built strong ties with Greek intelligence services. Officers trained in the United States returned home more loyal to Washington than to Athens. And the Greek military, purged of leftists, became a conservative bulwark, watching for communist threats both real and imagined. Democracy limped along, until it didn't. By the mid-1960s, a new political force had emerged, the Center Union Party, led by Georgios Papandreou, the same Papandreou who had once tried to unite Greece in 1944. His return, decades later, inspired hope and fear. The hope came from a generation of Greeks tired of authoritarianism, corruption, and foreign manipulation. They wanted real elections, true civilian control of the military, and an end to political vendettas. The fear came from generals who saw echoes of Iam Elas in every reform. To them, Papandreou's populism smelled of socialism. His calls to investigate the military's political activities were intolerable. When he tried to remove certain generals from power in 1965, they revolted not openly, but through political sabotage. His government collapsed. 2 years later, on the 21st of April, 1,967 tanks rolled through the streets of Athens. The colonels had seized power. They shut down parliament, arrested thousands of political opponents, and imposed strict censorship. Torture became routine. Books were banned. Public gatherings were outlawed. And the West said little. The United States, focused on Vietnam and containment, tolerated the junta as a lesser evil. Better a right-wing dictatorship than another communist domino. For 7 years, Greece lived under this boot. Until, ironically, the military's own hubris, a botched intervention in Cyprus, triggered their fall in 1974. Democracy returned, but the ghosts of the civil war remained. Today, the Greek Civil War is rarely discussed in polite conversation. It is too raw, too recent, and too unresolved. There is no national holiday commemorating its end, no parade for its veterans, no single monument to the tens of thousands who died because no one can agree on who was hero and who was traitor. Was Emalas a freedom force betrayed by imperial powers? Or was it a communist insurrection that sought to impose totalitarian rule? Was British intervention a necessary evil or an imperial overreach? Did the Americans save Greece or merely postpone another form of tyranny? The answers shift, depending on whom you ask and where you ask it. Greece, wrote one historian, is a country with too much history and too little time to heal from it. In recent years, younger generations have begun to revisit the war not through slogans, but through film, literature, and oral testimony. Archives once sealed have been opened. Stories once suppressed have begun to surface. Grandchildren ask grandparents what really happened, and sometimes they get an answer. Closing reflection: the irony of freedom. The Greek Civil War began with a dream that after occupation, the Greek people would finally rule themselves. But the story of Greece, from 1944 to 1949, is not just one of civil war. It is the story of what happens when empires in decline and in ascent fight their battles in the homes of others. It is the story of ordinary people, caught between kings and commissars, ballots and bullets, and asked to choose a side, even when neither side spoke for them. And it is a warning that freedom, once fractured by foreign ambition, is hard to restore. Empires fall not by enemies, said a Greek philosopher, but by erosion from within. In trying to save Greece from itself, the West may have condemned it to decades of silence, suspicion, and scars. The Cold War would rage on, but it began here, in the hills of Macedonia, in the streets of Athens, in the haunted silence of a people torn in two,